All right, ladies and gentlemen, Grunts and Pogues, welcome to another episode of Talking Guns. So tonight's episode, our subject is going to be classes of fire with respect to the ground, the target, and the gun. I'm going to give a pretty good deep dive into each one of those classes of fire and get into every element of those classes of fire so that, I suppose I could just break it apart for you. All right. Got a nice little sideshow prepare. The beer of the night. Beer of the night. Past Blue Ribbon. I'll already opened the fucker up and drank about 3 of them. I'm not going to go crazy here because it doesn't sit there and label what the freaking ABV or IBUs or any of the other fuck bullshit is on this beer because it's a classic. But by guessing by the way I feel after about 3 of them, I'd say it's probably about 4.2 to 4.7. All right, pitter patter, let's fucking get at her. All right, so here on my slideshow that I've developed for you, we're going to start with our classes of fire with respect to the ground slides. All right, so getting from, well, the beginning. Here we have our grazing and plunging fires. All right, these are the 2 classes of fire with respect to the ground. I'll go into explaining what the hell those mean. All right, firstly, come on, guy. Do the thing. Come on, man. You know the thing. All right. So this class of fire with respect to the ground, grazing fire, is when the cone of fire does not exceed 1.8 meters or the average height of a man or flat or evenly sloping terrain. Now, by this graphic and by the definitions brought to us by the new doctrine and by new FMs, it's based off of the center of the cone of fire. So when the center of the cone of fire does not rise above 1 meter, is the new thing, right? And it's like saying the old thing, except differently. It's like saying the same thing, but different, right? So anyway, how does this achieved? All right, so let's break this down real quick, all right? So you have your line of sight, which is essentially the horizontal line between your eyeball, its elevation and vertical interval, and the line of the target and where they exist, right? And elevating the axis of your bore upward increases your range, right? And also increases the friggin' ordinate of your trajectory. So we talked about trajectory, how friggin' elevation is and stuff like that, right? Elevating your axis of bore increases the friggin' height of the trajectory of your rounds. Trajectory is the path the bullet takes through the air, and because it's a machine gun firing a burst fire, it has multiple friggin' trajectories, thus making a cone of fire. Yeah, we talked about that last time with the characteristics of fire, yeah? All right, so the highest point along that trajectory is the maximum ordinate. All right, you can see that about 2/3 along that line when you're... Wait, that you're looking at right there? Yeah, that little guy. So about 2/3 along that distance is maximum ordinate. That's the maximum height of the trajectories within that upper bound of that vertical cone of fire. Should be about 1.8 meters, making the center of a cone of fire about 1 meter when you are engaging with grazing fire. So going on with that a little bit more. Cool. So here we look at another graphic of what grazing fire is. So we look at the cone of fire flying through the air and shit like that, and essentially it's freaking big old fucking circle and shit that exists before the rounds within your burst start impacting the ground, creating your beaten zone. All right, so that center of the cone of fire should be no more than 1 meter above the ground, so that you use the entirety of your cone of fire grazing along the ground, like skipping rocks across a pond, just to simplify. Grazing fire distances, respectively, for medium machine guns and heavy machine guns. For a medium machine gun, we're looking at 600 meters, and for a heavy machine gun, around about 700 meters before you've elevated that cone of fire so high that a man could crawl underneath it and still freaking low crawl and close distance towards you. All right, and the purpose of grazing fire is to mitigate that. All right, this time, are there any questions? All right, so there's that. So some reasons or some science behind the whole thing, right? So reasonably, as we talked about, friggin' trajectory and elevation of axis of bore, as you elevate the axis of your bore, you will increase the height of your cone of fire, right? And that will also increase your range. So when you increase that ordinate out to 300 or 3 meters off of the deck, it goes out to a range of about 1,000 meters. if your vertical interval is essentially 0. Going out to 1500, you'd elevate that freaking axis about 10 meters. That gives you a lot of fucking distance between the lower bound of the vertical cone of fire and the height of a man. Even at 3 meters, where the average height of a man is 1.8 meters, all right, your entire cone of fire is essentially missing them at about half of the distance. So at about 500 to 700 meters, a man could freaking comfortably and briskly walk toward your fucking position until he starts hitting rounds at around fucking 400 fucking meters. All right, just because of how high you've elevated your axis of bore. And I need not explain it more with the bottom graphic. With 25 meters of fucking elevation, those motherfuckers are walking a long, long way to get underneath you because you're freaking firing way up in the air, yeah? All right, makes sense. At least I hope it does. All right, some reasons why you would not use Grazing Fire, all right, are, well, obviously ranges. Greater ranges greater than freaking the achievable range for Grazing Fire do not allow or permit the use of Grazing Fire, all right, where the cone of fire does not exceed 1 meter. Center of cone of fire does not exceed 1 meter off of the deck, over flat or evenly sloping terrain, or the classic definition of when the cone of fire does not exceed 1.8 meters or the average height of a man over flat or evenly sloping terrain. Yeah? Cool. Damn, I'm talking too fast. Sound like Ben fucking Shapiro, yeah? All right. Other instances where you may use something other than Grazing Fire or where it may not be permissible. When you're positioned in Defilade. So Defilade is placing a mask or a piece of terrain between you and the target, or because, you know, targets don't just sit there, they fucking shoot back at you, right? So you want to fucking provide yourself some cover and concealment from them, right? So when you do that, there may be the freaking need for you to elevate your axis of bore above that mask, or freaking elevate that axis of bore to freaking, you know, achieve fires over that mask. So in these positions of Defilade, first of all, direct lay, you need not. However, Grazing Fire cannot be achieved because you're not firing straight at a fucking target over flat or evenly sloping terrain, are you? Same thing with partial Defilade. You have a line of sight that freaking elevates over the mask and is able to achieve the target, but still don't have the freaking terrain. Even when you get down to the maximum position of Defilade, where the terrain is reasonably flat or evenly sloping going upward, all right, you're not achieving your target because you have to, when you fire over a mask, you have to do it at great ranges in order to allow the angle of fall to have any effect on the target, all right? And with minimum positions of Defilade, it may be doable and stuff, but it's dependent on the freaking terrain right before you. So that's it with that one. Another reason is something in between you and your target that friggin' eliminates your dead space at some point. So, eliminates your Grazing Fire at some point, and that would be dead space. Any area between the muzzle of the gun and the beaten zone where your target cannot be covered by fire or observation. So you cannot be visually or physically observed by fire. That is dead space. It provides them with something to hide fucking behind or under or underneath your fires. So in these fucking respects, or with these things in mind, we use a little thing called Plunging Fire, the other classifier with respect to the ground. So that's when your rounds are not grazing along the ground, but they are plunging into it. So this applies from high to high, mid to low, or low to high. All right, as depicted in this diagram, firing from on top of a high piece of terrain and at a great distance at another high piece of terrain, leaving a large swath of ground uncovered by any sort of freaking machine gun fire, right? Or firing from high to low and plunging directly into the deck, leaving large to medium swaths of ground freaking vastly uncovered, or from low to high and firing up into a surface, right? So these are Plunging Fire.However, with this, you can effectively cover targets with direct fire. It is better to cover distances, or it is better to cover dead space with indirect fire or high angle fire, so that you can, and predetermining those distances and registering those fucking targets or those target reference points before making that engagement. Normally at this time I would ask if there was any questions, but I know you can't ask them because this thing isn't live. So, there it is. Plunging Fire. Again, difference between Plunging Fire and Grazing Fire is exactly this. Going back to the original graphic. Alright? Now, that's done. Just go back to this whole screen here. Hope I didn't explain that too fast. This next one's going to be fucking wild and shit. It'll be classes of fire with respect to the target. And that's cool, I guess. I suppose I should talk about the ground a little bit. All right, so the attitudes of the ground are something that you're not necessarily in control of. It's really just what happens or what's right before you. Now you can control to a point where you fight or from what directions that you fight, but you can't necessarily control where the enemy is going to come from, right? So classes of fire with respect to the ground relies heavily on your ability to freaking do an analysis of the mission, the enemy, the terrain and weather, the troops and fire support available, right? The freaking time and space considerations available for you freaking be able to move and place your guns or place your troops and shit on that plan. Cool. So this MET-T analysis, mission, enemy, troops and fire support, terrain and weather, time and space available, MET-T analysis is critical for the planning phase of an operation. All right. So beginning the planning and understanding whatever the order that you received was, breaking that down into pieces, and then friggin' doing reconnaissance, arranging a reconnaissance and making that reconnaissance and getting the fine details decided, and then flipping that map around and asking yourself, what would you do if you were the attacking force or the enemy, or if you were the defending force for when you're coming upon the enemy? What would they do? What would be the enemy's most probable or dangerous course of action for you? So you make moves to counter that. All right, you get into their decision cycle process and freaking flip the tempo in your favor and stuff using the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act faster than they can. That's simple. Well, it sounds simple. When I say it, it sounds simple to me because I do it a lot. So there's that. Anyway, now we get more into the enemy-oriented part of this discussion, where we talk about classifier with respect to target. I'll pull up these slides real quick. Boop, boop. All right. So beginning with the classifier with respect to the target. Bam. There we go. All right. With respect to the target, look at these diagrams. All right. So you see these big old blocks, and they got fucking arrows sticking off the ends or out of the middle of them. Those little arrows, they depict the direction of movement of the enemy. All right. So how the enemy is moving. All right. The types or these classes of fire are called frontal, or with respect to the target or what the target is doing, frontal, flanking, oblique, and enfilade. How they present themselves to you. Here's another graphic that might clean things up a little bit and be a little bit less confusing if, this is your thing. All right, for a frontal target, you can see the frontage of the target, but both arrows are moving toward you. A flanking target, both of them moving, basically perpendicular to your direction of fire. An oblique target moving at a friggin' angle, acute or obtuse and shit like that from friggin' perpendicular or parallel and shit from your direction of fire, and then enfilade moving along your direction of fire or away from your direction of fire, but the long axis of that coinciding with it. All right. Well, anyway, let's do this one by one. So a frontal target, it really does depend on size on this one, right? But a frontal target is when that target, regardless of friggin', length, width, or size and shit, is coming toward you. This is a frontal target. You engage it with frontal fire because they are fucking shooting at you as much as you are shooting at them. That's the thing. All right. They'll do that. Next. All right. So we have flanking fire. Flanking fire with respect to the target is if the target is moving perpendicular to your direction of fire or your line of fire and stuff, right? And you are able to catch them on the side. This is typically when the target has a long axis that is perpendicular to your direction of fire, so you have to use some sort of distribution of fire from left to right or right to left to traverse along them in order to engage the entire target. But really, we're just engaging the flank of the target. Oblique. An oblique target is where they're at some sort of angle, whether it be acute or obtuse, from your direction of fire, moving toward or away from, at an angle that is somewhere in between perpendicular and parallel, or like coinciding with your direction of fire. But the thing is this, right? There are angles that nearly coincide that are friggin' still applicable to either one, flanking fire, or frontal fire, or even enfilade fire when we get to that one. But you know, it doesn't take any fucking math whiz to decide which one's which. All right, you know, I mean, whether the most, we'll get there. All right, fuck it. Next. All right, so here's basically the three that I just covered. All right, frontal, flanking, and oblique. These are in, you know, whatever, however the enemy wants to produce themselves to you. Now, the next one that I want to cover is pretty much our favorites as machine gunners, and otherwise known as a machine gunner's wet dream. So this is called enfilade fire. Enfilade fire is when the cone of fire, or when the freaking long axis of the beaten zone coincides or nearly coincides with the long axis of the target. So this can not just be the beaten zone, but can also be used with a cone of fire while applying grazing fire, or even flanking fire. When you look at this, all right, you have two targets presented toward you, where the long axis of those targets coincides with the long axis of your beaten zone or your direction of fire, right? We talked about the beaten zone during characteristics of fire, all right, and it's basically that cigar-shaped freaking impact freaking area on the ground that your cone of fire makes when the lower bound of the vertical cone of fire strikes first and the upper bound of the vertical cone of fire strikes last. But the width of the freaking rounds does not distribute much more than 2 mils in width, right? We talked about what a mil was also during that episode, so I hope you remembered. But yeah, basically that. And you can cover the majority of the target with your beaten zone and with your cone of fire using just a single burst, maximizing the effectiveness of the beaten zone. This is why we call it a machine gunner's wet dream, because we provide the most death, destruction, and chaos with this class of fire with respect to the target. If the enemy is dumb enough to show themselves to us in this formation, or if we are smart enough to position ourselves to create this enfilade by canalizing the enemy, or positioning ourselves at a distance to freaking create that canalization and make or take advantage of the terrain that we decide to do battle on and create our engagement area there, that is smart. That's a win for the MET-T analysis. All right, so yeah, again, enfilade fire, that's how it's spelled, E-N-filade. Boom. Long axis of the beaten zone coincides or nearly coincides with the long axis of the target. Now, okay, so now that we've covered classes of fire with respect to the target, I suppose it'd be a good time to transition into yet another subject. All right. Well, not just a good time. I mean, we have to, because we fucking talked about all of it, don't we? Drink more beer. All right. So, classes of fire with respect to the ground, classes of fire with respect to the target, they're good and all, right? But these are factors that you have to exist in and deal with, right? The ground, you don't always get to choose the ground that you fight on, all right? Now, you can pick the ground you decide to engage on, but you can't decide which way the enemy is going to move. So somewhere along the enemy's freaking direction of movement and shit like that, or somewhere toward the enemy and shit that you decide to do battle, you can't always pick the perfect conditions for that, all right? Now, you can have an eye for the ground and decide where not to be, but not necessarily where to be, because that may be freaking contested at some point. So you do battle, and you seize that terrain that is most at your greatest advantage, but at that point, you lose the element of surprise. Okay, cool. So you just do your best with the ground. It's a thing, All right, that was a fucking Longstreet, who was one of the subordinate officers to General Lee and shit like that. Was a guy that was big on the ground. All right, and didn't like that they chose Gettysburg for that battle. And well, you know, by his prediction, they did lose, and you can read about that in a book called The Killer Angels. It's a good one. Enjoy. Anyway, moving on from that, targets can't always decide which way the enemy is going to depart their friggin' cover or concealment, the tree line, or friggin', you know, from their area from which they decided to, you know, move from, or what formation they decide to be in as they're moving on down. All right. So classes of fire with respect to the target are not necessarily in your control, but they are up to you to exploit and set yourself up on the ground to maximize the effectiveness of your beaten zone, to use it to your advantage, to basically force the enemy into a situation. That would be good. So canalize them if you can. Set yourself up around a fucking hill, so when they pop over the fucking ridge and shit like that and start going through the saddle, that you can effectively hit most of them. But yeah. But here's the part that you can control and the part that you can manipulate, which is the classes of fire with respect to the gun. All right, so with respect to the gun, there are 6 classes. And we'll talk about them right about now. So right now, what you're only seeing is 5. I get it. But I'll talk about the 6th one in basically in free form and shit like that, right? So you have this. All right, look at the bottom of these things and stuff. You see a little dot. Look at the top. You see a cigar shape, and that basically depicts the difference between the dot being your gun position and the large cigar shape being where your beaten zone is impacting. Kill. All right, so the first one, fixed fire. When you have a target that is fewer than 2 mils wide, either a standing man or at a distance, friggin' a vehicle and shit like that, or an immobile vehicle, a window or another port of entry like a doorway or some shit like that, or a canalized point where you only have to keep your gun there and you have to make no adjustments within for elevation or traverse. This is called a fixed target, and therefore fixed fire is used. All right, you just keep hammering that fucking area with the same freaking data on your gun without moving it at all. I think there's more to this. I wanted to introduce something else before I got into this. That's right. All right, there it is. All right, so before I get too far into this, by fixing your gun onto a position, you usually have your weapon system freaking mounted on something like this. All right, a tripod. All right, this is the M122 Alpha 1 tripod used for medium machine guns like the M60 or for the M240 freaking, you know, class machine guns and shit, whether it be freaking Bravo, Golf, Echo, or what the fuck ever and shit like that. It has an old school flex mount on it. Don't worry about that. Usually right now we use a pintle locked into the freaking pintle bushing and shit like that, which is forward of this other mechanism here called the traversing and elevating mechanism. You see that big black block that's sitting across that bar going horizontal across the screen. All right. On that bar that goes from leg to leg, there is some friggin' notches of data, numbers and shit, which I'll show you in the next slide. Next slide. Next slide here. All right, so take a look at this little guy right here. This is your traversing and elevating mechanism. I want to orient you really quick onto the bottom of the screen. All right, where you see the little bar. All right, where you see a little bar. All right, you notice that there's little fucking tick marks all over it and shit like that and numbers. All right, those tick marks, they start at the number 0. 0 is at the center. All right, and it goes like 450 left and 425 right and shit. All right, but you have to look up at the top. All right, now too. All right, so that up at the top, you got this thing called the friggin' elevating hand, the traversing hand wheel. So traversing hand wheel manipulates the offset head, the center right there, along that little pin, right, using the traversing screw. All right, push right up, pull left down. All right, so if you're pushing that knob, all right, it should move the barrel of your weapon to the right. That means the offset head is going to be going to the left. You know, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. It goes on the fucking reverse side and shit like that, because that's just the way things work, especially when you have the fulcrum or the pintle mounted forward of the mechanism. That's just how it goes, man. I hope I didn't fucking confuse you. Wow. Let me slow down. All right. So, the pivot point of a machine gun is mounted forward of this mechanism that makes the adjustments. Therefore, any adjustment that you make on this mechanism will cause the weapon to manipulate in an opposite direction. Alright? Just like if I were to sit my arm on this and I wanted to control it by moving my elbow. If I move my elbow to the left, it moves my fingers to the right. If I move my elbow to the right, it moves my fingers to the left. That's basically as simply as I can put it. Fucking shit. Alright, so there's that. The next thing is elevation, right? And same concept applies by freaking pivot points and fulcrums and pins and shit, right? When you depress this mechanism with the upper elevating screw, and it compresses down and freaking, you know, basically crunches and shrinks the size of this mechanism, it increases the axis of bore, raising the freaking barrel in height to increase your range or increase the height of your cone of fire, right? So down at the very bottom again, you have this sliding scale, right? You unlock your traversing slide lock lever and shit like that, and you can freely move this thing in traverse left and right. And that's basically how this works. Now, the data on this, you see a bunch of fucking tick marks all over this damn thing, right? I will explain that later in another episode when I talk about predetermined fire, how to fucking set up a range card and shit. All right, so there's a lot of ground to cover there, but these things are important, and the data on this gun is important as long as the tripod remains fixed in the ground in the same fucking place. All right, and that you maintain, you know, consistent shoulder pressure on the weapon system and shit to fire at the same relative location. All right. Moving on. All right, back to fixed fire. So you don't have to move any of that shit. It just stays locked down where it is, and you fire. Traversing fire. So this is using your traversing screw, making those left and right adjustments and shit like that. So minor adjustments in traverse with freaking basically no adjustments in elevation will give you your traversing fire. So this is when you have targets that are distributed over a freaking width and shit like that, or when you have a wider target that you need to have some distribution of fire on and cover the entirety of it. All right, so not a very wide area, but a slightly wide area. So what we're looking at with this one is about I don't know, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 14 fucking mils wide of a target. Cool, about half the width of a finger in a target. So when you're looking at that, you're not seeing much. All right, it's about like 7 men marching abreast, right? Or like 4 guys walking with a little bit of distance between them and shit, like 1 arm's distance, right? Or 2 dudes walking with some dispersion. You need to traverse fire, or the width of a fucking vehicle and shit, or a large freaking courtyard doorway, or the frontage of a small building. These things, using traversing fire, firing a burst, adjusting 1 to 2 clicks, firing a burst, adjusting 1 to 2 clicks, firing another burst, adjusting 1 to 2 clicks, and shit to distribute those fires in a traversing manner. That's traversing fire. Boom. All right, so getting back to it. Next class of fire is searching fire. So I want to actually get into depth with this one just a little bit, because it is about depth. It's about the length of your target or the depth of your target, and how it friggin' changes in distance, right? So searching fire is adjusting the elevating hand wheel, or the elevating friggin' part of your traversing and elevating mechanism, to increase or decrease the axis of bore to be able to engage a target that has length or depth or height, whatever. All right, something like that. But whatever it is that is not width, as far as like axes go, Sure. So, I've I brought you a little fucking treat. All right. So how I do this? All right. I got you a little table, and I'm gonna go ahead and reference the Bible here. From my fucking super awesome book that I like to read from, the Marine Corps Warfighting Publication 3TAC 15.1 Machine Guns and Machine Gun Gunnery, or Marine Corps Technical Publication 3.01 Charlie. Fuck. If you go to Table 1 from Annex A, yeah. So Annex A, or freaking known as page A2 and shit like that, right? Is Table 1 is the angle of elevation, dimension of cone and beaten zone, angles of fall, freaking time of flight and drift, and how to use it. All right, we don't need to know how to fucking use it. I'll tell you. All right, so follow along with me and shit like that. On the far left column, you have this thing called range, right? Next thing, you have the angle of elevation. All right, the very next column down, you have the difference between that last one and the next one. So that's going to be the important part and shit like that. Don't worry about necessarily the length of the, or the, you know, the vertical cone of fire 100% and shit like that. Sight, you want to fucking talk about length a little bit. We'll go a few more columns down as far as the effective 82% beaten zone. But for the most part, this is where the most meat lies, is right here with respect to friggin' searching fire. All right. So you can reasonably expect that you don't have to elevate your friggin' gun that much beyond friggin' 6 mils and shit like that, or up to 7 mils when you're engaging up to 600 meters where you have grazing fire. So when you get out fucking larger distances, think about, all right, start with 500 mils, right? Go there. Look at that. Look at that. 500 mils. 5 fucking things down. Or 500 meters, sorry. Angle of elevation is 5 mils, right? Now, we're going to increase our range to 600. Now, we've gone 6.5. So we've gone about 1.5 friggin' mils. That means we have to round up and use 2 mils, right? Because, you know, rounding up at 0.5s, right? And then you go up again from 600 to 700. It goes from 6.5 to 8.3. That's a difference of 1.8 mils. That's basically click it up again 2 mils, right? Increase it again to a distance of 800 meters, right? Click, click, because 2.2, you round down, right? But you got to think about, this is about the center of your cone of fire and shit like that. The center of impact is essentially where they freaking get these ranges from. And your 100% beaten zone is going to be like a freaking certain size, but your 82% beaten zone is going to be relatively around 50 to 55 meters long. At the shorter ranges, about freaking 75 meters long. All right, you look at the one right there at 500, it says 86, and you can reasonably expect it to shorten. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have like fucking all that area of effect. You just have rounds skipping off the ground for a certain fucking distance and shit like that. As you increase the range, that length of your friggin' 82% beaten zone continues to decrease, while the width of your 82% beaten zone remains essentially the same in fucking width out to 2,500 meters, where you start to get some erratic flight of those rounds. But for the most part, it remains 2 mils wide. All right. So the width of your beaten zone is not the concern here. The length of it is, because it is shortening, therefore becoming less effective as far as friggin' distribution of fire. So you have to elevate 2 mils, 2 mils, 2 mils, but you don't necessarily have to because of the friggin' distance along the ground. You'll still be able to effectively hit it if you go up 3 mils or 5 mils. You'll still be friggin' having rounds coming down until you get out past friggin', I don't know, let's say 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 meters and shit like that, where it starts to drastically friggin', well, not really drastically, but decides to really remain the fucking same as far as length. Now, you have to incrementally friggin' increase your axis of bore, keeping the same freaking length of beaten zone. So it's really like fucking changing, but you have to make greater adjustments in axis or in elevation to be able to achieve those distances. They go up by 1.8, now 2.2, 2.6, 3.1, 3.7, 4.2, 4.7. making greater fucking adjustments in between those ranges to move that center of impact by 100 meters. So basically, as you get further away, do more clicks so that you can cover more ground. Otherwise, you're just overlapping and you're wasting a whole fucking bunch of rounds on shorter distances. That's all I really have to say about that part, especially when it comes to fucking distances greater than 700 meters and you're using freaking plunging fire. I hope that's not too confusing. It probably is. But if you read the book and you look at the freaking data, it kind of makes some sense. Well, it makes a lot of sense to me, but it might not make sense to you. Figure it the fuck out. You're supposed to be a master of your craft, right? Enjoy. All right. Next piece. Reversing and searching. So it's a combination of freaking both those adjustments in elevation and those adjustments in traverse. Or direction and axis, right? Or not and axis of bore and freaking elevation, right? So look at that. Looks a lot like an oblique target. So when you're engaging oblique targets or a freaking area that runs in an oblique to you, you may want to use this one, right? Something that has some depth and has some width. You might want to use this fucking one. It'd be cool. Be cooler if you did. All right, so free gun. Well, I guess before I get into that, notice how these things are all like fucking spread apart, up, down, up, down, up, down. Now I want you to just use your brain and imagine for me if these were all in a freaking flat line. There's another classifier called swinging traverse. That's when you unlock the freaking traversing slide lock lever and you make major adjustments in freaking traverse and little to no adjustment in elevation to engage targets over a wide range or a very wide area. You can do that and especially if you don't have a lot of fucking difference in range or if you have flat or evenly sloping terrain, it'll work out for you. But this one right here is essentially called free gun. As when you unlock your traversing elevating mechanism from your gun completely and you allow the gun to move freely along that friggin' pivot point, the pintle where it is fixed into the tripod, and you engage targets at whatever direction and will sporadically and as effectively as you possibly can, anywhere you possibly can. All right. At this point, that's it. That's all I've got. I mean, so free gun is best used in freaking situations where you have like enemy that are attacking you from multiple directions and shit like that, and freaking appearing in a fashion that is sporadic or freaking incalculable, and you have to take on targets of opportunity, or in an area that is freaking built up like an urban area where they have multiple freaking apertures from which they can engage you from, like windows and doorways or rooftops or fucking ledges and shit like that. They can just pop out of any fucking where and hit you. So you have to be able to freaking engage those targets of opportunity with speed and efficiency, and you don't have time to be manipulating a fucking mechanism to do that. You need to fucking swing and move your motherfucking body to be able to do that. So do that. Yeah. So there it is. And this has been another episode of Talking Guns, where I drink beer and I talk about fucking machine gun shit and just do the thing. All right. I encourage everybody to go ahead and fucking dig into the knowledge. The doctrine exists and stuff like that, but you know, call it doctrine if you want to, but it's not that fucking restrictive. It's really just a lot of fucking really good suggestions. Like it's a guidebook for knowing your fucking job and shit like that, and gives you the basics of the physical world around you and the realities of it, and terms with which to communicate how you will overcome it or how you want somebody else to overcome it, given a fire command. And I will talk about that more on a follow-on episode when I talk about methods of target engagement and another one after that when I talk about methods of fire control. All right. So there's some episodes that I promise you right from like right now, and you can hold me to it and shit like that. We're going to talk about predetermined fire and how to fucking create a range card. There's one. Methods of target engagement will be another one. Methods of fire control will be another one, if I don't blend it into methods of engagement and shit like that. And that'll include initial and subsequent fire commands and how to keep those concise, and machine gun communication and brevity of speech. And that'll be fucking important. Like, yeah, I'll talk about some of that shit, and that'll be fun, because that's what I do. Talk guns and get drunk. Yeah. All right. So, hope you enjoyed this episode. Oh yeah, read some fucking literature too. There's some good books out there. One by Guy Sayre called The Forgotten Soldier. Another one called With the German Guns by if I can remember. You can watch or you can read I'm Staying With My Boys, or you can read Robert Leckie's fucking Helmet for My Pillow. That'd be good. Any fucking machine gunner book is pretty much fucking legit as balls. All right, but yeah, that's some real quick freaking stuff for reading. Also recommend The Devil's Guard. That's a good one. All right, but yeah, have fun. And shit, man. I don't mean what do you fucking say? I mean, what did you say to people? Like, I don't know. Kill bodies, eat babies. Fuck off.